And let me ask you something. What if I told you that falling in love after 60 can be more dangerous than falling in love at 20? And not because you're weaker, but because for the first time in your life, you actually know what you stand to lose. At 20, love feels like an adventure. And at 60, it feels like a risk. Because now you don't just have a heart, you have history, you have scars, memories, and routines you fought hard to build, peace you earned. And yet, you meet someone and suddenly that carefully built life starts to shake, and no one warns you about this part. No one tells you that love, at this stage, doesn't just open your heart, and it reopens everything you thought you had already healed. So today I want to talk about that love, the kind that arrives later in life, and quietly asks, and are you brave enough to feel this again? When you fall in love after 60, the stakes are no longer abstract, they're real, tangible, and deeply woven into the life you've spent decades building. At 20, you can afford to lose yourself a little. You can afford heartbreak, confusion, and even chaos, because you still feel like you're in the process of becoming. But at 60, you're not becoming anymore, you've become, and you've built a life with structure, habits, relationships, and a sense of identity that didn't come easy. It was shaped through years of experience, mistakes, and sacrifices and resilience. And that's exactly why love at this stage carries a different kind of weight. Because now when someone enters your life, and they're not just entering your heart, they're stepping into a world you carefully created. A world that likely includes your routines, your independence, and your emotional boundaries, and the peace you fought hard to achieve. And the truth is, peace at this stage of life is priceless. And it's not something you casually risk, it's something you protect. So when love shows up and begins to challenge that peace, even subtly, and it creates an internal conflict that many people don't talk about, you find yourself torn between the excitement of connection and the fear of disruption. And there's also the reality of financial stability. By 60, many people have spent years working to create some form of security, whether it's savings and property or simply a manageable, predictable lifestyle. Falling in love can complicate that. Suddenly, decisions are no longer just about you. And you may feel pressure to merge lives, share resources, or make compromises that affect your long-term security. And while love can be beautiful and it can also blur judgment, you might overlook practical concerns because emotionally, it feels good to not be alone, to have companionship, and to feel desired again. But those emotional highs can sometimes come at a cost if not balanced with clarity. Then there's the emotional investment. At this age, and you don't love lightly. You don't date casually in the same way you might have in your younger years. When you open your heart, it's intentional and it's meaningful, and that makes it riskier. Because if it doesn't work out, the impact isn't just a temporary heartbreak, it can shake your sense of stability, and it can make you question your judgment, your ability to trust again, even your understanding of yourself. And recovering from that isn't as simple as it once was, because your life is more settled now. Disruption feels bigger. Another layer to this is independence. And many people in their 60s have finally reached a point where they feel comfortable being alone. Not lonely, but at peace with their own company. And they've developed routines that work for them. They've learned how to navigate life on their own terms. And love, while beautiful and can challenge that independence, it asks you to compromise, to adjust, to make space for another person's needs, habits, and expectations. And while that's part of any relationship, it feels different when you've spent years becoming self-sufficient. There's a quiet fear of losing that autonomy and of becoming emotionally dependent again in a way that could leave you vulnerable. You also have to consider the emotional history you carry. By this point, and you've likely experienced loss in some form, whether it's the end of a relationship, the loss of a partner, or other significant life changes. And those experiences shape how you approach love now. They make you more cautious, more aware of what can go wrong. And while that awareness can be protective, and it also adds weight to every decision, you're not just asking, do I like this person? You're asking, and is this worth the risk of everything I've already been through? And perhaps the most subtle but powerful aspect of having more to lose is this, and you've built a version of yourself that you respect. You've learned your worth, you've defined your boundaries, and you've figured out what you will and won't tolerate. and falling in love can sometimes challenge that clarity. Because when emotions are strong and it's easy to bend those boundaries just a little, to make exceptions, to justify behaviors, deep down and don't align with the life you've worked to create. And that's where the real danger lies, not in love itself, but in the possibility of compromising the very things that took you a lifetime to understand about yourself. So when people say love is beautiful at any age, and they're not wrong, but what they don't always tell you is that at 60, love isn't just about what you gain. It's also about what you risk. And that risk deserves to be acknowledged, respected, and approached with a level of awareness that honors everything you've built. And by the time you reach 60, you're not walking into love as a blank page. You're walking in as a whole story. Every relationship you've had and every disappointment, every betrayal, every moment of deep connection has left a mark. And those marks don't just disappear with time. They settle into you. And they shape the way you see people, the way you interpret words, the way you react to silence, distance, affection, and conflict. So when love shows up again, and it doesn't meet an untouched heart, it meets a heart that has already learned, sometimes the hard way, what it means to be hurt. And that's where things become complicated. Because emotional baggage isn't always obvious. It doesn't announce itself the moment you meet someone. And it shows up quietly in subtle reactions. It shows up when a delayed message suddenly feels like rejection. And it shows up when someone's tone reminds you of a past argument. It shows up when you hesitate to trust a compliment because once a long time ago and someone used kind words before letting you down. These reactions aren't about the person in front of you. They're echoes of the past. But in the moment, and they feel real, immediate, and justified. The weight of past heartbreak can make you more cautious, and in many ways that's a strength, and you're less likely to ignore obvious warning signs. You're more aware of patterns that once caused you pain, but that same awareness can also turn into hypervigilance. You start reading between the lines too much. You look for hidden meanings in simple actions, and you question intentions even when there's no clear reason to. And without realizing it, and you may begin to protect yourself from a pain that hasn't even happened yet. The problem is in trying to avoid being hurt, and you can also block the very connection you're hoping to build. There's also the reality that not all wounds have fully healed. Time can soften pain, but it doesn't automatically resolve it. Some experiences leave questions that were never answered, closures that never came, or emotions that were never fully processed. And when a new relationship begins, those unresolved feelings can resurface, and you might find yourself reacting more strongly than expected and feeling triggered by situations that seem small on the surface but are deeply connected to something older. It can be confusing, even frustrating, and because part of you knows you're not just responding to the present, but you're not always sure how to separate the two. And trust becomes one of the biggest challenges. When you've been hurt before, especially deeply, trust is no longer something you give freely, and it's something you guard. It's something that has to be earned slowly, carefully, sometimes even reluctantly. And while that makes sense, and it can create distance in a new relationship, the other person may feel like they're constantly being evaluated, tested, or held at arm's length. And they may not fully understand that your hesitation isn't about them, it's about everything that came before them. But from their perspective, and it can still feel like a barrier. And then there's the fear of repetition. And one of the most powerful effects of emotional baggage is the quiet fear that history might repeat itself. You start to wonder, and what if this ends the same way? What if I go through all of this again, and only to end up in the same place? That fear can influence your decisions more than you realize. It can make you pull back when things start to feel serious, and it can make you second guess happiness, as if you're waiting for something to go wrong. And sometimes it can even lead you to sabotage something good, and simply because it feels safer to end it on your terms than to risk being hurt again. At the same time, and emotional baggage can also create a kind of emotional depth that didn't exist before. You understand love in a way that's richer, more complex, more real. And you know that it's not just about attraction or excitement, it's about patience, understanding, and resilience. And you've seen both the beauty and the difficulty of relationships, and that gives you a perspective that younger versions of yourself didn't have. But that depth comes with sensitivity. You feel things more fully, more consciously. And that can make both the highs and the lows of love feel more intense. And there's also the challenge of vulnerability. Opening your heart again after it's been hurt takes courage. It means allowing someone to see you, and not just as you are now, but as the sum of everything you've been through. It means risking judgment, misunderstanding, and yes, the possibility of pain. And when you carry emotional baggage, vulnerability can feel even more exposing. You're not just saying, here I am. You're also saying, and here's what I've been through, and here's what I'm still carrying. That level of openness doesn't come easily, and especially when past experiences have taught you to be careful. And what makes this even more complex is that both people in the relationship are likely carrying their own baggage. And it's not just your past interacting with the present, it's two histories, two sets of experiences, two emotional landscapes trying to find harmony. And sometimes those histories don't align perfectly. One person's trigger might be completely different from the other's, and one person's way of coping might clash with the other's needs. And navigating that requires a level of patience, communication, and self-awareness that goes beyond surface level connection. So the weight of emotional baggage isn't just about having a past, and it's about how that past continues to live within you. It's about the ways it influences your thoughts, your reactions, your expectations, and your fears. And while it can make love more complicated, it also makes it more meaningful. Because choosing to love again, despite everything you've experienced, and isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. But it's a strength that requires honesty. Honesty about what you're carrying, how it affects you, and in what you need to move forward without letting the past control what the future could be. By the time you reach 60, and the walls you've built around your heart are not accidents, they are carefully constructed, reinforced over years of experience, and in many ways, and they've served you well. They didn't appear overnight. They were built moment by moment, after every disappointment, every broken promise, and every time you trusted and felt let down. And over time, those walls became a form of protection, not because you stopped believing in love, but because you started understanding the cost of giving yourself too freely to the wrong person. So when love shows up again, and you don't rush toward it the way you might have decades earlier, you pause, you question, and you pay attention to details that your younger self might have ignored. And this isn't cynicism, it's wisdom. It's the result of lessons learned, and sometimes painfully, about what happens when you overlook red flags, when you compromise your boundaries, or when you invest in someone who isn't truly aligned with you. Being guarded at this stage is not a flaw, it's a sign that you've grown. But here's where it becomes complicated, because the same walls that protect you can also isolate you, and they can make it difficult for someone to truly get close, even if their intentions are genuine. You may find yourself holding back emotionally and not fully expressing how you feel, not fully letting someone in. You might keep conversations at a surface level for longer than necessary, avoiding deeper vulnerability because it feels safer that way. And while that safety is comforting, and it can also prevent the kind of connection that love requires, there's a subtle difference between being careful and being closed off, and sometimes that line becomes blurred. You might tell yourself you're just taking things slow, but in reality, you're not allowing things to progress at all. And you might say you're protecting your peace, but deep down, there's also a fear of what could happen if you let that peace be disturbed. And that fear isn't irrational, it's based on real experiences. But if it goes unchecked, it can quietly turn into a barrier that keeps love at a distance. And another challenge of being guarded is that it can affect how you interpret other people's actions. When you've been hurt before, and you become more sensitive to potential signs of trouble, you notice inconsistencies, you pick up on small changes in behavior. And while that awareness can help you avoid unhealthy situations, it can also lead to overinterpretation. And you might assume the worst when there's a simple explanation. You might pull away at the first sign of discomfort, and even when it's something that could have been resolved with communication. In trying to avoid pain, you may end up avoiding connection. Trust, in this context, and becomes a slow and deliberate process. You don't give it easily, and you don't give it all at once. It has to be built step by step through consistency and honesty and time. And that's understandable. But for the other person, it can sometimes feel like they're constantly trying to prove themselves. And they may feel like no matter what they do, it's not quite enough to break through the walls you've built. And if they don't understand where that guardedness comes from, it can create frustration or distance in the relationship. At the same time, and being guarded can also mean you're less likely to tolerate behaviors that don't align with your values. You've learned what you deserve, and you're not willing to settle in the same way you might have before. You're clearer about your boundaries, more confident in enforcing them, and more willing to walk away if something doesn't feel right. This is one of the strengths of being guarded, and it helps you protect your well-being and maintain your self-respect. But even this strength requires balance, because if your standards become too rigid or if your expectations leave no room for human imperfection, you may find it difficult to connect with anyone at all. And there's also the emotional risk of misjudging a good person because of past experiences. Someone might come into your life with genuine intentions, patience, and care, but your guarded nature may prevent you from fully seeing them. You might keep them at a distance long enough that they eventually give up, and not because they didn't care, but because they felt they couldn't reach you. And later, you may look back and wonder if your need for protection cost you something meaningful. And what makes this even more complex is that being guarded doesn't always feel like a conscious choice. It often feels automatic, and it's the instinct to pull back when things start to feel too real. It's the hesitation before opening up about something personal. And it's the voice in your mind reminding you of what happened last time. And while those instincts are there to protect you, and they don't always distinguish between past threats and present opportunities, they respond based on memory, not necessarily reality. And yet, and despite all of this, there's still a part of you that wants connection. A part that is willing to take the risk, even if it's cautious. And a part that understands that love, by its very nature, requires some level of vulnerability. The challenge is not to tear down your walls completely, and that wouldn't be wise, but to learn when and how to open the gates. To recognize when someone has earned a little more access, a little more trust, and a little more honesty. Being guarded at this stage of life is not something to be ashamed of, and it's a reflection of everything you've been through and everything you've learned. But it's also something that needs awareness. And because while those walls can protect your heart, they can also keep it from experiencing the very thing it still longs for. And finding that balance, and between protection and openness, is one of the most delicate and most important parts of falling in love again after 60. By the time you reach 60, and loneliness doesn't always look the way people expect it to. It's not necessarily dramatic or obvious, and it doesn't always come with visible sadness or constant isolation. In fact, it can exist quietly even in a life that seems full, surrounded by family and familiar routines and a sense of stability. It can show up in small moments, a quiet evening that feels a little too quiet, and a conversation that ends and leaves an echo, a space beside you that no one occupies. And because it's subtle and it can be easy to misunderstand what you're truly feeling, this is where loneliness becomes misleading. And because when someone new enters your life and brings attention, warmth, and companionship, it can feel like something powerful is happening, and it is, but not always in the way you think. Sometimes, and what feels like deep romantic connection is actually the relief of no longer feeling alone in those quiet moments. And it's the comfort of having someone to share your thoughts with, someone who listens, someone who notices you. And that feeling can be so strong, so refreshing, and that it's easy to interpret it as love, even if the foundation isn't fully there yet. At this stage of life, the desire for companionship is deeply human. And you've lived enough to know that life is richer when shared. You've experienced what it's like to connect with someone on a meaningful level, and you understand the value of having a partner, not just for romance, but for presence, support, and understanding. So when that possibility appears again, and it's natural to feel drawn to it. But the challenge is distinguishing between genuine emotional compatibility and the simple and powerful pull of not wanting to feel alone anymore. Loneliness can speed things up, and it can make you overlook the natural pace that a relationship needs in order to grow in a healthy way. And you might find yourself opening up more quickly than you intended, sharing parts of yourself that usually take time to reveal. And you might start to imagine a future with someone before you've truly understood who they are in the present. And it's not because you're careless, and it's because the feeling of connection after a period of emotional quiet can be incredibly compelling. And there's also the way loneliness can shape your perception of the other person. When you're craving connection, and it's easier to focus on the positives and minimize the concerns. And you might highlight their good qualities while brushing aside behaviors that don't quite sit right with you. And you might tell yourself that certain differences aren't important or that certain issues can be worked through later. And while optimism is a beautiful thing, and it can also cloud judgment if it's driven more by emotional need than by clear understanding. And another aspect of this is the fear of losing the connection once you've found it. When loneliness has been part of your experience, even quietly, and the idea of returning to that state can feel uncomfortable. So you may hold on more tightly than you should, and you might avoid difficult conversations because you don't want to risk conflict. You might compromise in ways that don't fully honor your needs, and simply to keep the relationship stable. And over time, that can lead to a dynamic where you're not fully being yourself, but rather adapting to maintain the presence of someone else. And it's important to recognize that loneliness doesn't always mean something is missing in your life. It can simply mean you're human. But when it goes unacknowledged, it can influence your decisions in subtle ways. It can create a sense of urgency where there doesn't need to be one. And it can make you feel like this opportunity is rare or limited, even when that may not be true. And that sense of urgency can lead you to invest emotionally before you've had the chance to fully evaluate whether the connection is right for you. And there's also the difference between being alone and being fulfilled. Many people in their 60s have built lives that are stable, meaningful, and even peaceful. They have interests, relationships, and routines that bring them satisfaction. But even within that fulfillment, and there can still be moments of wanting something more, something deeper, more intimate. And that desire is valid. And the key is understanding that adding someone to your life should enhance that fulfillment, not become a way to fill a perceived emptiness. And when loneliness is the driving force, there's a risk of placing too much importance on the relationship too quickly. The person becomes not just a partner, but a solution to silence, to routine, to emotional gaps. And that's a lot of pressure for any relationship to carry, and because if the connection isn't truly balanced, if it's built more on need than on mutual compatibility, it may not sustain itself in the long term. And at the same time, it's important not to dismiss the value of companionship. Wanting someone in your life is not a weakness, and it's a reflection of your capacity to connect, to share, to care. But the challenge is making sure that desire doesn't override your clarity, and that you're choosing someone not just because they're there, but because they align with who you are and what you need. Awareness becomes essential here, and taking a step back and asking yourself honest questions. Am I drawn to this person because of who they are or because of how I feel when I'm not alone with them? Am I seeing them clearly, or am I seeing the relief they bring into my life? And am I moving at a pace that allows me to truly understand this connection? Or am I rushing because it feels good to have someone here? Because the truth is, and loneliness can be a powerful emotion, but it's not always a reliable guide. And when it leads you into a relationship, and it can create a foundation that feels strong at first, but may not be as stable as it seems. Recognizing that doesn't mean closing yourself off, and it means approaching connection with a deeper level of honesty. It means allowing yourself to enjoy the presence of someone new, and while still giving yourself the space to see things clearly. In the end, the goal isn't to avoid love, it's to make sure that when you choose it, and you're choosing it for the right reasons, not just because it fills a silence, but because it truly fits into the life you've built and the person you've become. By the time you reach 60, your life is no longer just your own, and it's deeply interconnected with the lives of others, especially your family. Children, and in many cases grandchildren, are not just part of your story, and they are a central part of your identity, your daily life, and your emotional world. So when love enters at this stage, it doesn't arrive in isolation, and it arrives into a system that already exists with its own dynamics, expectations, loyalties, and sensitivities. And that's where things can become unexpectedly complex. Because falling in love now isn't just about how you feel, and it's also about how your choices ripple through the people closest to you. Your children, no matter how old they are, and may have their own reactions to your new relationship. Some may feel happy for you, genuinely wanting you to experience companionship and joy, but others may struggle with it, even if they don't say it openly. They may worry about how this new person will affect your life, your well-being, or even your legacy. They may question the intentions of the person you're with, especially if they feel protective of you. And there can also be an emotional layer tied to the past. If you've lost a partner or gone through a significant relationship before, and your children may still carry their own attachment to that history. Seeing you with someone new can bring up feelings they weren't expecting, and loyalty to the past, discomfort with change, or even a sense that something is being replaced. And while those feelings may not be entirely rational, and they are real, and they can influence how they respond to your new relationship. Then there's the question of acceptance. And a new partner doesn't just have to connect with you. They often have to find a place, however small, within your existing family structure. And that's not always easy. Personalities may clash, boundaries may feel unclear. There can be unspoken expectations about roles, involvement, and respect. And even simple things like family gatherings, holidays, or traditions can become complicated when a new person is introduced into the mix. And what used to feel natural may now require negotiation and adjustment. Grandchildren add another layer to this dynamic. They may form attachments quickly, or they may feel confused about who this new person is in relation to their family. And as much as you may want to protect them from uncertainty, and you're also navigating your own emotions at the same time, and balancing your desire for happiness with your responsibility to maintain stability for younger family members can create a quiet but constant tension. And there's also the reality of differing expectations between you and your partner. They may have their own family, their own children, and their own responsibilities and traditions. When two lives come together at this stage, it's not just two individuals, it's two entire worlds. And blending those worlds requires patience, communication, and sometimes compromise that goes beyond what either of you anticipated. Decisions about time and priority involvement can become more complex when multiple family systems are involved. Financial considerations can also become sensitive, and family members may have concerns about how a new relationship could impact inheritance, assets, or long-term planning. And even if those concerns are never spoken directly, they can exist beneath the surface, influencing attitudes and interactions. And for you, this can create an additional layer of pressure. You may feel the need to reassure your family, to prove that your decisions are thoughtful and responsible, and while also trying to protect your own right to happiness. And what makes this particularly challenging is that you may find yourself in a position where you can't fully satisfy everyone. And if you prioritize your relationship, some family members may feel overlooked or uncomfortable. If you prioritize family expectations, and you may feel like you're holding back in your relationship. And navigating that balance requires a level of emotional awareness and strength that isn't always easy, and especially when you're also trying to enjoy the experience of falling in love. There can also be moments of guilt, and guilt for wanting something for yourself at this stage of life. Guilt for making choices that may not align with what others expect from you. And even though, and logically, you know you have the right to pursue happiness, emotionally it can still feel complicated. Because the roles you've played for so many years, and parent, grandparent, provider, don't simply disappear. They remain part of how you see yourself and part of how others see you. At the same time, and it's important to recognize that your life still belongs to you. Your need for connection, companionship, and love doesn't diminish with age, and it doesn't need to be justified. But acknowledging that doesn't remove the complexity, it simply helps you face it with more clarity. And it allows you to approach these situations with honesty, both with yourself and with your family. Communication becomes essential in navigating this, and being open about your intentions, your feelings, and your boundaries can help reduce misunderstandings. It doesn't guarantee acceptance, but it creates space for understanding. And over time, as your family sees the reality of your relationship, not just the idea of it, they may begin to adjust and to soften and to find their own way of accepting this new chapter in your life. Ultimately, and family complications don't mean that love at this stage is impossible. They simply mean it requires more awareness, more patience, and more willingness to navigate situations that are not always straightforward. Because when you fall in love after 60, and you're not just bringing two hearts together, you're bringing entire histories, relationships, and emotional ties into the picture. And learning how to honor all of that without losing yourself or your happiness in the process becomes one of the most delicate parts of the journey.